Did you support the invasion of Afghanistan?
Oh yeah, well I was like probably like 13 years old. So,
Yeah. Well, in hindsight, I
yeah.
guess. Yeah.
No, I not as like a nation building effort, right? Like I believe, yeah, totally send in special forces, but as a nation building effort that like to topple the Taliban and put something in its place, like no, I couldn't support that nowadays for a couple of reasons. Number one, now with the benefit of hindsight, we can certainly see that that was just like not a productive effort of like using 20 years of blood and treasure and just again, the number of terrorists in Afghanistan now compared to, with ISIS having arisen in the vacuum compared to what it was like if we had just gone in and more surgically to try to kill bin Laden, which was, still an option for us to do, given the fact that Afghanistan did not really, even under the original Taliban, have a functional nation state. We could have still gone in unilaterally and done everything that we ultimately ended up doing to kill bin Laden and eliminate Al Qaeda, and probably ended up with a lot less Al Qaeda supporters around the world too. But the other thing is too, I think we're still using that same authorization for the use of military force as our legal basis for going into pretty much like every country around the world now. We still continue to use it. It still hasn't been repealed, but I think that's a little bit, again, this is just my own opinion, not as a, member of, as a representative of the government in any way, a little bit disingenuous to like, say, okay, we've been attacked. You all as the Congress need to authorize us to use military force to go after the people who attacked us. Okay, I agree with that, right? But then to continue to use that same authorization for use of military force to go into dozens of countries around the world without like getting a democratic buy-in from the rest of the, the people, so to speak. We do get appropriations. We do get choices to whether to fund the military or not. That seems to me to be a little bit more of a, kind of a blackmail type situation, right? Because they faced that with the Iraq War too. Once it started losing support, the Bush administration would say, well, if you don't authorize funding, you're going to withdraw support from troops that are on the battlefield, right? That's not a real, democratic buy-in to like whether this war's, supported. So the outflow of this, that authorization for the use of military force has been, we're in so many countries around the world, the American public doesn't even know that we're in because we're still using this authorization as our legal basis to go in. That doesn't seem to me to be in line with the principles of democracy and with, a well-ordered government that has the true consent of the governed. So there's multiple reasons why I wouldn't support the nation-building project in Afghanistan, even though in some ways maybe you could argue that, it was easier for us to get Al Qaeda since we had a base there. That doesn't hold a ton of water with me, but I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah, so you're not of the belief that counterinsurgency could potentially work. A counterinsurgency in the event that an insurgency has actually came about in Afghanistan, but the argument that if we didn't intervene in Iraq in 2003 and kept focus on Afghanistan with all of the collection assets, all the money, all the soldiers, all those things, and really didn't, sway, that potentially we could be in a much better place in Afghanistan today. We shouldn't have done it in the first place in terms of nation building, and it wouldn't have worked no matter what. Is that your view?
Yeah. I don't think nation building in Afghanistan was ever going to work. But
no matter what, yeah.
Again, not an expert. Maybe somebody could really sell me on it and say,
yeah,
there was some way to do it. It didn't even seem like, when the Afghan papers came out, which we referenced in the last, podcast, it didn't even seem like the people who were most in the know thought it could work.
Sure.
Like the people who were the most read on and the most had access to the most, information at the time. We won't know whether the policymakers had that same feeling. I would guess they probably did too. The civilian policymakers during the bulk of the Afghan war probably had some of those same feelings as well, that they didn't really know what they were doing.
Yeah. Let me take it to a further extreme, just so we can try to cover all the bases. Did we have any legal right of going after bin Laden in the first place? I mean, So, sure, he attacked us, but he's living in another country that we have no domain over. And who are we to take a military force, whether it be a special forces operation or not, and drop ourselves into another country and start kicking in doors looking for bin Laden? Do we have any right to do that?
Yeah, I think so. And you know what's funny is I wouldn't have answered that question the same way when I was, of more of a libertarian lean. I would have said,
Right.
no, you kind of need like their consent to go in or something like that. Uh, but no, I just think like it's a function of national sovereignty that if somebody attacks you, like if you're a strong country, you're going to be able to go in and get that person by hook or by crook. So
Yeah.
I don't think that there's like some absolute moral, um, principle violated by like, oh no, we need to respect this third country that is, that happens to have this terrorist inside. Certainly, the United States never believed that. We've never believed that as a country, right? That we have to necessarily ask permission. If we want it bad enough, we're going to go in and do what we
Right.
want. And I'm pretty much of that mind too at this point. Is like, if we need to go in, that's part of the benefit of being a superpower is that if somebody attacks us, we can go in and take care of it.
Yeah. So, but from a moral perspective, ethical and even legal, not a power perspective, but a legal perspective. Let's say a terrorist from the United States goes into Mexico and kills 5,000 people. Mexico claims it's some guy who's living in Kentucky, but we don't feel like the legal system was, didn't, Mexico can't prove it. They say it's this guy from Kentucky, but we don't really believe them because we don't trust their legal system. Does Mexico have does the legal authority to drop their special forces into Kentucky and get this guy? Start kicking doors in?
Yeah, well, they'd have the moral authority to do that, right? Like if let's say the United States was really like just underhanded with them, and we knew that whoever committed the terrorist attack was here, and we were just like, no, sorry, we're not going to give him back.
Right, right.
Like, yeah, it'd be moral and ethical of that Mexican government to say, no, we're going to do what we're going to do anyway and sneak people into the country and go and try to take them out. That I think from a moral standpoint, that would be fine. And in fact, maybe even the Mexican government would have the moral obligation because
Sure.
what's more basic than needing to defend yourself in your country, right? But the fact is they do live in a country that has not made the investments in their defense infrastructure to be able to do that. And part of the consequence of that is that they can spend money on other things. They don't have to worry about, some of the things that we have to worry about in terms of our obligation. But part of the con of that is that they have to rely on us. And if a bigger country tells them, sorry, we're not doing it, Mexico doesn't have any options. And that's, the level that their government is comfortable operating under.
Yeah, so given that point, given the point that the reality is that the powerful countries have power, they have authority, they have money, they have larger militaries, and so it was incumbent upon the government and the military of the United States to go after Bin Laden because he literally killed our innocent civilians. Then we should also have the same outlook when it comes to intervening, whatever that means, economically, militarily, throughout the world, because we are the most powerful. And we should, because we have that right. And we're sorry that, Romania doesn't have a GDP and a military like ours, but if you're going to do something that upsets us, then and something that may end up damaging the United States in some way, then we're going to come in and intervene, right?
Yeah, and I think the difference that comes up with the United States, where I would like say, okay, we're getting a little bit morally murky, is that the United States is claiming, well, that's not exactly what's going on here. You see, we have all of these authorizations and these legal reasons for going in. It's more like the charade that I take issue with.
Yeah.
Is it's not. I would almost value the honesty if somebody actually came on and, like you just described, said, hey, we're not going to let anybody who hurts the United States, take advantage of us or, do anything. And we're going to go off in these countries. And if we think that somebody's going to be a threat to us, we're going to take them out. But that's not even in many cases, like really tied to what we're doing in these countries either. Right. We're supporting different governments. Some of them are democratic. Some of them are not. They just don't seem to have that pinpoint accuracy that you would want in like a genuine moral response to things, right? There's a lot of money being spent. There's a lot of troops overseas in different places, and nobody's really made that argument, right? Nobody's really come
Right.
out there and said like, hey, this is why, and this is why we need it, and this is why it's right for us to do that. Because we also have to put on this kind of theater, I think is probably the best word for it, where we say, oh no, these are all sovereign countries, and we're doing this with our people's consent, and we have to do that because it's one of our like guiding ethos that we sell to the rest of the world too, right? We say like,
Yeah.
this is how a nation behaves, right? And that has that argument, the difference between what we're selling and what the world actually sees has made the world more cynical and more open
Sure.
to the Putin types that are like, hey, this is just might making right. Look at what they did in Iraq, and so the people who are actually going along with this are just being paid off by the United States, right? It would almost be better just to say, hey, this is why we're doing it, and we're not going to put up with somebody attacking us. Maybe even the terrorists would take that more seriously. I don't know.
Sure. Isn't that what we're doing in Ukraine? I mean, isn't the support of Ukraine, a country that has called for help, who is a sovereign nation, who has been illegally invaded, and is literally crying for help in any way, military, economic, all the other things, isn't isn't the United States doing the right thing by standing up for those ethos you mentioned and the idea of democracy and freedom and all those things? And aren't we doing that? Isn't the intervention that we have in Ukraine today the right thing based on that description?
Yeah, in terms of saying, okay, this is a democratic country, and that's why we're going in there, and that's why we're supporting these guys. It's a democratic country versus the authoritarian country. Is that what you're trying to say? Maybe you could tease that out a little bit more for me, and
Yeah,
how it
I don't know
connects together.
necessarily
Yeah,
democratic, but I mean, we were talking about the United States having the power and the authority to defend itself by going anywhere that we want to as a defense of the United States. But we also have allies that have very similar worldviews politically as we do, economically and other things, but as we do. And so aren't we doing the right thing by helping Ukraine, another democratic, freedom loving, sovereign nation, generally speaking, and defending against a nation that doesn't act like that, because that's who we proclaim that we are?
yeah. That's like it's an interesting question because even right now, in terms of the countries that we support, uh, we don't have a perfect track record in terms of like, well, all the countries that we support are democratic countries, right? Or all the countries that we support are countries that don't have aggressive actions against their neighbors. So it's kind of a mixed message, I would say, right? If somebody could really sell me, and I'm certainly, again, I'm not an expert on Ukraine and Russia. There's so many people like Lieutenant Colonel Bennett, for example, who you've had on, who are just like so much more knowledgeable than me in that area. I'm really more of just a casual observer of the news on this one. I personally, if somebody could really sell me on like, hey, this is a benefit for the United States. This is why we need to be in there. We're doing this, and it's going to really pay off for us down the road. That would more resonate with me. I feel like when the rest of the world sees us and we kind of portray this as some sort of a Marvel movie where we have like the ultimate bad guy on this side, and we always go back to Hitler, right? It's like
Yeah.
they're just like Hitler, and we have on this side is like this plucky democratic country, right? When you look at that and just compare that to the reality of the countries that across the spectrum we support, things that we've done in the past, countries that we've supported in the past, and it just doesn't ring true for a lot of countries, and that might even hurt us, right? Because when we make that argument to people, in other countries, do they see some cynicism there? Maybe, I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know. I personally, I would feel more comfortable if we just made the argument, hey, this is why it's better for us. And some people have articulated that and said, hey, supporting Ukraine is in our best interest. Um, you know, I, yeah, so I would almost feel more comfortable with that, but I think it's like a little bit of a mixed message when you look at like just the history of where the United States has been on the issue of like authoritarian action versus supporting democracy.
Do you see a connection between Ukraine and Taiwan? Do you see the argument, which I hold, I believe, that supporting Ukraine and defending that sovereign nation against Putin demonstrates to China a resolve and a willingness to defend our allies to Xi if he ever puts himself in a position to take Taiwan by force.
Yeah, I think there's a good argument to be made with that when you look at the amount of consequences we were able to bring to bear over Putin. During that period of time, it was certainly painful, and that's good if you want to disincentivize other people from doing the same thing, but bad if Putin's able to pull it off. Right? Let's say he leaves, and the ultimate way this story is written is that the U.S. resolve wasn't strong enough over a long enough period of time because we're a democracy and parties change. And, if you just hold out long enough against the United States, you're going to be able to get, largely what you want anyway, as long as you're willing to suffer some short-term pain. That could very well be how this story ends. And that wouldn't be good, right?
Yeah.
There's that. Or maybe the answer is, well, we need to do a better job of building ourselves up so that we don't repeat what Russia does. So you see, it's very hard to predict, with any certainty what the ultimate lesson is going to be learned by a foreign power that thinks very differently than we think. So again, I feel more comfortable as far as like saying, well, as a country, is this really in our best interest? Russia seems to be aggressively acting in their best interest, right? And they articulated the exact same thing that we just discussed, which was, if you listen to Putin's declaration of war, he said, essentially, there are big countries and there are small countries. Small countries get rolled over. Big countries are able to assert their dominance over other countries. We're going to be a big country, and we're not going to let ourselves get rolled. And this is part of that, right? It's kind of, the canons of the French king, it was inscribed the last argument of kings, right? And it's like this imagery of like, no, the sovereignty is the ability to exert your military dominance over another country, and that's what we're doing here.
Yeah. Let me ask you. We've certainly made mistakes. So I'm going to get to some of the core arguments here. We've certainly made mistakes when it comes to intervention overseas. But isn't it the case that no country is perfect, and on balance, any country that is in a position like the United States to intervene for the greater good, or at least as we see it, right? Admittedly, as we see it, that just because there's going to be mistakes doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it in the first place. I mean, I look at it almost like a sports season, right? I mean, you're going to go out there every single week and you're going to play a game and you're going to hope to win every single game, but sometimes you won't because we're just not perfect. So if we want to intervene because we think it's a good idea, World War II, Kosovo, Rwanda, but then sometimes when we intervene and it doesn't work, Iraq, that doesn't mean we should shut it down. Right? Because if we shut it down completely, then what do we have?
Yeah. I think that's a great argument for the case of like we should not close ourselves off ever to having an intervention, right? I think we could certainly, we shouldn't say, oh, just because this went bad, we should never intervene in another country ever again, right? Even obviously, I'm not a cheerleader for for these interventions that we've been doing in the Middle East. In case you haven't picked that up and listening to this conversation, wouldn't rule out intervening if it was in our best interest to do so. But when we talk specifically about like the world policing that we've been doing, right, with this overthrowing of, these kind of strongman dictators and kind of picking up the pieces afterwards, hopefully, that particular scenario that we kind of see, it's almost in like, I'm trying to think of a good example of like what it could be like. But it would be like if you had a pool party and like you invited over a bunch of kids for your kids' pool party or something, and somebody drowned in the pool, right? Nobody would go after you, primarily as the person who just like hosted the pool party, right? Because it's that's not exactly foreseeable that if you have a pool party, a kid's going to drown.
Sure.
We wouldn't blame you in the same way. But imagine if that happened twice.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Now people are going to start to ask some questions. They're going to be like, "Hey,
Sure.
John, you gotta like put a fence around your pool, maybe a pool alarm. You got to do something different here." All right.
Yeah.
Like a third time, a fourth time,
Right.
Like,
You're going
and
to
now you've
prison.
got, if you listen to some of these people, the people who are part of think tanks or whatever, they already have laid out what what Iran should look like, what we're going to do to Iran in the future. If we only, take out the head, we'll be able to do this and that. They already have a line around the block for the next couple of pool parties, right? And so at a certain point, there's a legal concept regarding liability that says that you're responsible not for all consequences, but you're responsible for foreseeable consequences, right? And once you've had a consequence, you've been put on notice, right? The United States has been put on notice a
Sure.
lot at this point, that the idea that policing the world, that we're going to overthrow largely secular dictators and strongmen, and that we're going to have a democracy put in its place, or even just something stable put in its place, has been thoroughly disproven. So I wouldn't say it rules out all interventions in the future, but that specific type of intervention, man, we really have to, have a lot of
Yeah.
evidence to the contrary that it's going to end up differently.
And you would say that there's a clear delineation, meaning, you could probably put into two categories the interventions that went well from our perspective, and those that didn't go well, both from our perspective and likely the perspective of those that live in those countries. And that line separates a whole bunch of variables, and between a whole bunch of variables on one side and then secular strongmen on the other, right? Is that how you kind of see it?
Sure. So
Okay.
I'll give an intervention that I would support. We knew where Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan. We went and landed special forces. We killed him. We extracted out. We did not have to overthrow the government of Pakistan. And you can make arguments that that was only possible maybe because we had a base in Afghanistan. I don't think that 100% holds up, but that's an intervention that I would easily support. That's an easy yes, right?
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't say no intervention. We don't know the second and third order effects. No, that's a clear one. And if that happened in the future, I think the United States should be willing to accept that and say, hey, we have a track record of being able to do that well, clear national interest, limited second and third order effects, and high payoff, right?
Yeah.
So if that explains what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, but let me ask: is there a line? What's your line? Meaning, what's the line where it is just, and I say just, but it's a secular strongman, who it looks as if there's not that much benefit to the United States if we take this guy out. It looks as if maybe it's just us trying to foment democracy, but he's killing 50,000 people a day. Is that okay, now we go in? Or does it still say, well, listen, if the only benefit is really us installing a democracy that never works, then he's just going to be allowed to continue to kill 50,000 people a day? What's the line?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's not a clear line, right? And a lot of these things come down to having to make decisions where there is no clear guidance for us, right? I would say let's try a lot more possibilities than we have in the past, right? For trying to provide some sort of carrot or stick to stop that from happening, short of nation building. I think nation building is a pretty good line at this point to say,
sure,
hey, if we're going in a country that's never really had anything but a strong man, the case for going into Iran is already being sold.
Sure.
It's been sold for decades now. There's been think tanks that are just trying to pump hey, the Ayatollahs, we just got to take these guys out and it's going to be a cakewalk, right?
Yeah.
And there's always some element of some humanitarian tragedy that's also sold with these interventions too. Libya is a good example, right?
Yeah.
It's there's all these civilian casualties, and now the country has more atrocities than you could than ever would have been possible under Gaddafi, right? So and just the heinous nature of it, but those are not what is shown in the media at the time we are being asked as an American populace to give our buy-in and our consent to the action, right? We're always given some really terrible story. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, right? We have atrocities that were sold on our going into Kuwait, for example, with Saddam, that he's doing these things to kids and bayoneting kids in hospitals, all these really terrible things. And some of that turns out to be true. Some of that turns out to be just complete nonsense. A lot of that was true around the initial incursion into Ukraine, right? There was all these stories that popped up that turned out like, maybe they're not so true, but like ultimately, like, the right thing to do is to go in. And so it seems to be like this commonality is like, there's a little bit of a hook, like, which is like, oh, there's this humanitarian situation, right? But we never really get to see the humanitarian situation that goes on then for the next 10 or 20 years as a result of our interventions. Those aren't front page on the news. You kind of have to dig to find out that, like, in Libya right now, there's like open chattel slavery.
Sure.
Right? You have to
Yeah.
like go and look that up and try to figure that out, that like slaves are being sold for like a couple $100 if in a slave market in Libya. And that's like a real human tragedy, right? That probably if
Yes.
we knew that was going to happen, we wouldn't have gone into the country. So there's things that are shown to us at the time to kind of, stir up the emotions of the American population to give their assent to whatever the intervention may be. And then, there's the untold thousands of people whose lives are impacted by that decision. So that's a very long way of me saying, there's, it's not easy to draw the line. I would say that anything that involves nation building, we got to really give like a serious, hard, pessimistic look to in the future.
Yeah. So how would you describe then? Is it the example you just brought up in Libya? Is that our fault? I'm playing devil's advocate here, but I don't sell slaves, and nor does the United States. And so you clearly have a group of people who live in Libya who believe that selling slaves is okay, and taking other tribes people, however the lines are being broken down, I would have to assume it's tribal, and selling them for a couple $100. That's a great thing. But they don't do it during Gaddafi's time. But it's not like they had a moral epiphany the day he left. So, but he does leave because of other reasons that the United States, articulated, and now they're selling slaves. Is that us?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there's some time honored principles of American jurisprudence, American law that, again, as maybe it's me as a lawyer, but I find them to be useful, right? In assigning blame and assigning culpability. If you go and you tell your friend as a joke, right, meaning no harm to them, like as a prank, you tell him like, oh yeah, you can go buy cigarettes and go into this neighborhood and, and you maybe think that he's going to get beat up or something like that. And he gets horribly maimed for the rest of his life. Who's
Right.
morally culpable in that situation? Well, you would say, well, the people who beat him up and did all those things are morally
Sure.
culpable, right? They put evil intent on him. I didn't have that intention in sending him there. I maybe thought that, he would get scared and run away. But in the American legal system, he can sue you, right?
Right.
If you had knowledge ahead of time that that was going to be a possible likely outcome of the situation, that person can still come after you for damages, and so I think there's some principles there that we can latch onto even when we talk about something as big as a nation state, right? Like, we're not morally responsible in the same way that a person who is selling other people and committing atrocities on the ground there is morally responsible. But we're responsible enough that we should take a very serious, hard look at ever doing something like that in the future, and maybe even take a little bit of blame. Maybe even get up in front of a press microphone and say like, hey, that didn't go well at all. And there's some terrible things going on there. And we really have to take a hard look at doing that in the future. But it just doesn't seem like that ever happens as a result of these interventions. There doesn't seem to be any like kind of national reckoning with, some of the second and third order effects. I think that would have a healing effect ultimately. I think there would be a little bit of national healing that would come from saying, hey, let's have a committee on this and talk about, and see the results, of some committee members exploring, hey, was this on net? Was this like a good intervention or not? Or, did we really have some evil on our hands as a result of the intervention?
Do we have a moral obligation to intervene in a scenario that doesn't provide any benefit to the U.S., but only to the people who live in that country? Is that even our problem at all?
That's a hard one. That's a really hard one. You know, I I would say no. I think I'd more come down on no. And maybe I
Okay.
could hear a really good argument for like why we should. But then I turn it around on that person too. Like,
Yeah.
I don't see many of the people who are advocating for these wars, even if it's to stop a genocide or something else. A lot of these people never serve in uniform. A lot of these people never join a freedom brigade that goes off into that country and goes and fights. And maybe they don't need to. Maybe that's not like maybe that's an incorrect moral standard, right? To say like, oh, if you are for the U.S. intervening, you necessarily yourself should have signed up to do X, Y, and Z. But I do think that there's a big disconnect between the people who are making these policy decisions and just observably what's going on in their lives. Are their children signing up to go to these wars? Are they, personally enthusiastic?
Yeah.
Are they involved as a genuine humanitarian concern? And there seems to be a real disconnect there. So part of me says no. But then again, like I'm the type of person, I'm sure you are, John, where if you saw somebody being attacked and you had the physical capability to jump in and to stop that, and it was happening right in front of you and you're able to do something, you would go ahead and do it. You would go ahead and jump in, if you saw somebody, going through a terrible situation. And I think I feel most closely able to answer that question the smaller the scale is, right? But you start to get really, really, I'm trying to look for the best word, but I guess I'm trying to say you start to get really abstract when you're talking about nation states and whether they have the same moral culpability as people, because we have a greater degree of second and third order effects as a nation state that we have to take into consideration too, right? It's not merely, are we going to jump in like the same way we would if we observe somebody getting tackled by three guys in the middle of the street at the dead of night, because that person ultimately will get them out of the situation. There'll be a police officer who shows up. There's a sense of accountability behind our actions, and we can assume that moral culpability for ourselves. Even if we jump in and it turns out the guy was like a bad guy, we can say, well, I'm wrong. I intervened. It looked like a good situation, but I did the wrong thing. And I assume that moral culpability for myself. You start to get really abstract when you're talking about that level of moral culpability applying to a nation state, where, okay, with the decision makers for this country now are going to adopt moral culpability for all the consent of the governed and everything that's going to happen second and third order effects after this, that starts to get a little bit janky for me. So, my heart goes out anytime I see like an atrocity happening. And I think the first instinct of many, many, possibly all like good Americans, when they see something terrible happening, is like, man, we should go in and bomb those guys. I think that's an okay, that's an okay impulse to have, but we also have to have like some level of restraint too. And just like a little bit of a lack of hubris, like maybe a diminished sense of hubris. There is a connection between democracies being more easily sold on going into these conflicts than other ones because it plays at our heartstrings. If you read even going back to like Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars and the wars in Persia, like the people who are trying to sell them on going to war with Persia, they first go to Sparta, right? And Sparta's like, get out of here. Like, they're like, how far away is Persia? And like, it, right? But they go over to the democracy next door, Athens, and they preach to them and they say, oh, these democracies are under attack. And like Athens, just their hearts bleed and they go for it, right? And the consequences that follow that are all this bloodshed. So there's a little bit of a lesson to be learned there, I think, about like moral culpability, democracies, and the tug on our heartstrings, where we also have to use our head a little bit too.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring up the point about those that have served, because as I had mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, there are some kind of universal arguments for and against the United States intervening, and one of the arguments for those that I don't really subscribe to, and I'll explain, but for those that don't believe we should intervene, they bring up the fact that those that do and have not served, or their family members have not served, and they don't really have that perspective, shouldn't be out there arguing for intervention. And I'm kind of torn in that, because one, it doesn't, we live in a society, first of all, that the military is controlled by civilians, and there's no requirement in our Constitution that says the president has to have been a veteran, or our congresspersons had to be veterans, and they send people to war all the time. So I don't think you have to serve to make those decisions. But at the same time, as a veteran, I get that there's a connection to that service, and potentially having a perspective that you cannot have if you didn't serve. But what I would say to you is if somebody were to ask me why I felt I was pro-interventionist, I would start by saying, well, let me make clear I am a veteran and I have served overseas numerous times. And by the way, I'm still pro-interventionist, not everywhere, obviously, but I do think that the United States has a moral obligation to involve itself in scenarios that may not provide much of a benefit at all to the United States, even if it's going to cost us money and even if it's going to cost us potentially some soldiers' lives. Not on any catastrophic front, obviously, but if it meant, I'm just going to make up some numbers here, right? Like, unfortunately, if we intervened in a scenario where a couple of hundred soldiers died, but we could argue and point out that we saved potentially 500,000 people in a country as a result, I would find that to be a good decision, a morally good decision, and an ethically good decision. And even if that person who died was me. Because at the end of the day, I carry this balance between my love for country, which I happen to think is obvious, and my support for the United States being the world leader. And I want to talk to you about that moral perspective in a second. But also, at the end of the day, I'm just a human, and my children. Let me say this a little differently because that's hard to say when I'm talking about my own children, but a generalized American child is not any way any better than any other kid in any other country, right? And so who are we? I could almost argue it's unethical to not intervene in a scenario where children, for example, are brutally being murdered. And we have the capacity, because we're rich and powerful, to do something about that, but we don't. Is that not the case at all? Or are we just, well, listen, the United States is just better and our kids are worth more and it's my tax dollars and I want my tax dollars to go to my kids so they can play baseball next year, or whatever silly thing we come up with. And so it's not really my problem that all of these other kids on the other side of the world are dying of hunger and mass slaughter or whatever, right? Am I crazy?
No, I think like, as any rational human being, if somebody puts something in front of your TV screen or in front of your phone that shows you suffering, I think it's just the moral compulsion of all of us to want that to stop. And we see, even in these children and these people overseas, we see our own children, our own wives, and our own families, and we want to put an end to that suffering. And I think that's like a good impulse for us all to have. I think there's also an element at play of, and maybe this is getting too philosophical or even religious, but I subscribe to more of like an ordered love, right? Where you have the most duty and responsibility to the people that are closest to you, right? And then beyond that, you still have levels of, wanting to, do something nice for people who are, in faraway countries. But ultimately, who you have the most responsibility to are the people that are the closest to you, right? For your kids first. I'm sure you'd feel the same way, but like I would let some of the entire populations of countries around the world, I could see myself putting myself in harm's way for some of them. But then you put that up against the life of like one of my daughters, I would let the whole island of Taiwan sink before I let my daughter die.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. So that is getting a bit philosophical.
Sure.
And I think it is, I think it's a worthwhile conversation, to be honest. I actually don't think it takes us too far on a tangent, because ultimately these decisions come down to philosophy. They come down to ethical and moral belief. And then you have the countries that are built culturally on certain religious ideals. And so, I think it is worthwhile.
Sure.
And obviously I'm married, I have kids, I love my children, and I understand the idea of ordered love. And of course I'm going to choose my child over my neighbor or than some random kid in New York or whatever. That's all sensible. But I don't think my point is, I don't think it de-obligates us from caring about others. If you get what I mean. Like, I'm not necessarily arguing to sacrifice my own children for somebody else's children, but if my children are taken care of, if my country is wealthy, if we're doing generally speaking, comparatively speaking, doing very well, which the United States is, even though we have all of our own little problems. But comparatively, we're doing just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a lot of debt, and we've got an immigration issue, and there's crime in some of our cities. Yeah, all those things are true, right? A lot of big countries have those issues too. But again, comparatively, we're doing just fine. That if we have we have an ethical or moral obligation to help others. I don't know. Maybe that's the softy and the hippie in me a little bit, but this is coming from a guy who's wearing a Thanksgiving T-shirt on a podcast here. So, now a couple of the other arguments against intervention. One of them is we should only be fighting wars of necessity. And I think this ties into what we were just talking about a moral obligation. And obviously the term necessity is subjective, and that's, that'll it's all based on your worldview and whatever. But I think, there are some clear lines. You could say something like, if there was only famine, and I say only, but you know what I mean. If there's like a famine in a certain country, but that country isn't affecting anybody else really, but its own self, and clearly is not a threat to the United States, then an intervention in that country is not necessary. And so what is your view on that? Should we be focusing more specifically on what it is that we consider necessary only?
Yeah. So I think necessary, again, you hinted at the fact that it's a little bit subjective, right? There's a lot of people who could sell us on like the worst intervention that you could possibly imagine the U.S. having gone into, or, even a historical intervention, pick your worst one. And there was people behind it saying, oh yeah, that was necessary, right? And it was necessary for these reasons. When I think of necessary, I think Colin Powell had some good thoughts on this too, but and maybe I differ from him in some ways. But I think, in terms of just war theory, I think certainly the closer you are to literally responding to an act of aggression against you, right, the more sure ground you're on.
Sure.
Right? Now, you could still get a little bit more removed from that and have like an actual preemption, right, a ticking time bomb type scenario. Somebody's armed a nuclear warhead. I think, you're still in pretty good moral ground in those cases, right? And then as you get further removed from that, where, the benefits start becoming a little bit more abstract, the strategy is becoming a little bit more abstract, you also have to keep in mind too, what kind of intervention are we talking about? You and I think in this conversation, are talking about a military intervention, but there's plenty of times where we've intervened diplomatically, and it had great effects. There's been times where we've intervene in a humanitarian sense with food deliveries and aid that, have just been amazing. And, those have worked out very well. So there's lots of ways in which you can intervene, but the military has a very specific purpose and very specific set of capabilities. I feel like the further and more, the further away that you're getting from the military's core mission set, to kill people and break things right on our behalf, the more unsuited it is to doing these things that are named necessities, but really aren't things that we truly need, like nation building, for example, right? There's just so much that goes into nation building. At times, even the State Department taking the lead in certain aspects of that I think we're poorly suited to. And that should be an indicator to us that like maybe there isn't this isn't an act of necessity. This is something that we're doing that actually we had some options maybe to do other things other than this.
Yeah, so speaking of necessity, let's leave aside some of the arguments on JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was, President Obama's deal with Macron in France, with Iran, and obviously overturned when President Trump came in. But, the concern of all of that is Iran and the regime in Iran right now potentially getting access to a nuclear weapon. Let's say that they do. Is Israel, or I'll even go before then, let's say they're on the precipice. Is the United States and Israel obligated to ensure that that country does not get access to a nuclear weapon, given their view of the world?
Yeah, I think who that would be necessary for most closely would be for Israel. Right, that Israel would have a genuine necessity to go into that situation and attack. Now, if Iran had an intercontinental ballistic missile and we believe that they were going to attack us in some way, now you're making a stronger argument that it's a war of necessity for us. And Israel has intervened many times to
Sure.
go stop Iran at some stage of infancy, from going in. But what's being sold to us as a war of necessity, this regime change project in Iran for the future, is often sold to us under the terms of necessity, right? You got like Bibi showing up in Congress and he's got like this chart and he says like, oh, when this reaches this, they have a nuclear weapon,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And like after like 30 years of him coming to Congress and showing that, you start to get the feeling like, maybe this is something that Israel can actually handle, pretty competently themselves, and doesn't really need to turn into a U.S. nation building war of necessity. As much as Israel would love that to happen,
Sure.
right, and us to take out an enemy of Israel, maybe for us is not an actual act of necessity. But sure, if they had like an intercontinental ballistic missile, or they were, able to impact us in some way, the argument becomes a little bit murkier because we do have troops that are closely based around Iran. Whether we could pull those back or not, it starts to get into a little bit of a gray area there.
Yeah. So let me ask this too. Nuclear. We had a conversation earlier about the nuclear weapons argument that having the capacity to kill each other with these weapons has created a more safe global environment. I do ascribe to that, as I had said. Would the United States be obligated to intervene in North Korea if they did not have nuclear weapons?
Yeah, sell me on it. I'll say that. Articulate that out a little bit in terms of a necessity.
Well, I would say that it would certainly lean more on the moral and ethical side. You're talking about an environment that is as close to 1984 George Orwell as you can imagine, right? There is quite literally not any freedom in that country at all. And it goes beyond the argument of, in my opinion, it goes beyond the argument of, hey, do we really need, or should the government really be more of an authoritarian strongman type or a democracy type or whatever? It's not on the scale, right? I mean, you're talking about you can't even live and work without having the dear leader's picture on your, on the wall. And if you are, for example, if you commit a crime, then three generations in your family are put into hard labor camps, even though they had nothing to do. I mean, these are just, to me, inarguable, immoral, and unethical decisions someone is placing on someone else. And talking about all the famine and people that can't survive. I mean, literally, these human beings are growing at a slower rate than anyone else in the world because they just don't have the food and the nutrition in order to keep up. And if you look at the DMZ as just another example, the tallest people, the tallest soldiers that North Korea can find to try and demonstrate a modicum of strength are like 4 inches smaller than anybody South Korea could put on the border. So yeah, it's just silly. I think it's obvious. The only reason the United States or quote unquote the West has not intervened in North Korea is because they have nuclear weapons. We don't want them shooting anyone. I would argue it's a moral and ethical obligation to intervene and take out Kim Jong-un and his family because of that behavior. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I'll go back to what a lot of people describe as a third world nation, North Korea, but in fact is a second world nation. And if you know what I mean by that, at the time of the, you probably know, but your listeners, at the time of the Cold War, right, there was like first world nations, there was third world nations that weren't aligned with the two powers, but North Korea is like one of the last standing second world nations that was, part of the system underneath the USSR that aligned with that country for that time and continues to align under those same principles. And yet we allied with the USSR in many ways, was just as 1984 as any other, country, and tolerated them because they had a nuclear weapon, even after World War II. So I think if you look at it under that lens, it certainly is okay for us to say, because they have a nuclear weapon, the morally right thing for us to do, even though there's tremendous suffering going on in that country, is that we need to look out after our own best interests, because at the end of the day, the government of the United States exists for the benefit of the people in the United States, and that they would suffer tremendously, not only in terms of the money and material and everything else that you could imagine, but in the cost of life that would happen from us intervening into that country, that it just wouldn't, it wouldn't be something that would be in our best interest. Now, if you make the strongest case possible, let's say you take away the nuclear weapons and you just have a dictator in there who's brutalizing his own people, and you say, well, is there an argument there to go into the country and go in and, you look at the military size of North Korea too. Like, that is not a small task, right?
Sure.
And again, I would go back to, the while the United States has the capability of doing a lot of different things, right? We're a superpower. We're able to flex our muscle. What at the end of the day is a government for, right? Is it this like humanitarian force to act around the world in the way that its decision makers see fit? Or is this something that is set up by and for the people of the United States, ultimately to ensure their safety, right? And I think the further that you move away from, this is going to be unsafe for the U.S. to live in, as an argument, and you move more towards, well, this is just going to make the people that are in that country suffer less if we have this intervention, leaving aside what could possibly be the second and third order effects of that. The further away you go from my comfort level in terms of an intervention. But, maybe you could sell it, like as a really complex, battle plan that, somehow is going to liberate everybody there overnight, and they're all going to be happy, and, they'll welcome us as liberators, and, it's going to be great if we intervene, and I'm not like ideologically, just closed off to the idea that there could be a scenario in which that's true. But, at the end of the day, the cost is going to be enormous for the American people.
Let me ask two more questions here as we're getting close to wrapping this up on part 3 of the discussion. Steve's been great to stick around long enough that we were able to turn this into 2 separate episodes. So this is great. Let me ask 2 questions, one pragmatic / realistic, and one idealistic and ethereal, and potentially even with a little bit of religious tone to it, but I think is an interesting way to kind of wrap this whole thing up. So the first one is, where do you stand on, and I think based on our conversation today, I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it nonetheless. Where do you stand on the idea, or the argument rather, that Russia has the right to operate in the same way that the United States does, and therefore has a right, or had a right, to invade Ukraine in an attempt to protect itself? The whole argument that NATO was expanding, there was potentially some promise that Putin often refers to, even though it was never written down, it was only in conversation, that NATO would not expand, and because NATO was expanding and Ukraine was looking towards NATO as a potential partner, that Putin felt obligated for his own safety. It's very similar to the United States would have done, let's say, if the roles were reversed and Mexico was looking to join the Warsaw Pact, for example. I mean, it's not even that far-fetched, right? We had what was the telegram from World War II? What was the name of the telegram? The Zimmerman telegram. Yes. That's right. Thank you. Yes. That's right. Anyways, and that nobody would argue against the United States potentially invading Mexico in a way to defend us. What is your stance on that? Are you of the belief that, hey, listen, the United States is like Russia. Russia is going to do the same thing the United States can do, so it has every right to go into Ukraine?
Yeah. So I think the government of Russia has a moral obligation to protect its citizens and to make sure that their well-being is assured, that they're not going to be invaded from other countries that surround it. So I think the core parts of what Putin is suggesting have like a moral hook to hang your hat on, right? And I think if those things were true, that he would have the moral right and even the obligation to go and invade a country next door if he thought it was imminently going to fall. Now, again, me not being an expert on this, I take the U.S. government at its word when it says that wasn't the case, and that we had no long-term intentions to bring Ukraine into NATO, and even if we did, like, we have no aspirations to in any way threaten Russia in the future, right?
Yeah.
And so that being the case, that matters, right? If that's true, and that Putin is playing fast and loose with the facts, then he's morally wrong, right? But if we're going to accept what he says in his declaration of war and just assume that maybe even he believes that all those things are true, then he would have even the obligation to go and act on his country's benefit. Now,
Yeah, but
yeah,
go ahead. No,
yeah,
no,
go ahead.
please.
No.
What I was going to say is even let's assume all those things are equal. I get your explanation. Right? Aren't we, as members of NATO and American citizens, aren't we supposed to be arguing that we are right? And what I mean by that is saying, like, if we have a Cold War scenario where there is NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and you want to argue that the Warsaw Pact has every right to exist in the same way that NATO has every right to exist, fine. But NATO's better because NATO's right, because NATO's of the West, and we believe in democratic principles, and those things are all better. And so while you may bring up the legal argument that Russia could do in Ukraine what the United States would want to do in Mexico, or could potentially do in Mexico, I don't want to hear it because you're not NATO, right? Aren't we at the end of the day supposed to believe that?
Yeah, and I think, like, if the argument is from the United States perspective, hey, this NATO thing is really helpful for us, it protects us, and we want to see it expanded as far as possible. I think that the U.S. has, also a moral, hook to hang their hat on as well, right? They're saying, like, hey, this is a tool that we have. We can make alliances with different people. We have a strong case to be made that Ukraine, for example, should be in NATO if that's what we want to claim in the future, and let somebody try to stop us because this is the best way that we have of defending ourselves. I'm not going to say that argument is also morally incorrect. But I would say if you're going to adopt that, that this is truly for our best benefit, you have to analyze pros and cons. Now you're down to an area of pragmatics, right? It's like, is this truly going to bring about a safer condition for us? And in that, you have to analyze weapons of mass destruction, right? You're playing with another player that has nuclear weapons. And that ostensibly is like unacceptable in other interventions that we have done, right? The whole reason behind certain interventions that we've done is, hey, there's like a possibility that a WMD could go off, right? We're willing to push it pretty close to, kind of playing with the pride of a man of dubious, mental capacity in Russia. Or at least that's what we're told, is that, he's at times unhinged and at times, can't be relied upon. So we're willing to push it pretty close, in terms of the con side of things, if we push it too close to his borders. So I would say, yeah, we also likewise have an obligation to get the best thing for our, citizens as well. But then it becomes a matter of pragmatics. Like, is it the best thing for us to be involved in this way when we're talking about a country that is adjacent, not to our own country, but to the country that we're seeking to influence?
Yeah, makes sense. So let's wrap it up with the ethereal question, the ideological one. Are the problems that we have today? We're having all of these discussions about whether the United States should be involved in other nations and what other nations have the obligation to do all these different things. Is it nationalism that is the issue? Is it the creation of nationalism coming through the 20th century? Probably not, right? Because humans had the same issues prior to nationalism when we had imperialism and we had empires. Humans have been fighting since day one, right? So maybe not. But let me ask, are we better off as a human race completely are we better off to envision a world where there are no separations between us in that way, and we work to try and unify in a sense and work as a singular entity to prosper and not be at odds all of the time with who has what resources and who has what a stronger military or or just simply better than the other.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made on that side that uh, largely revolves around the idea that human beings are going to continue to progress, even morally speaking, that we're just going to continue to get better and we're going to get a more shared understanding between each other. There's going to be more communication. There's going to be more interaction between people, and languages are going to break down, and there's just going to be an increase in human compassion for each other and understanding. I don't subscribe to that personally. I
Hmm.
maybe take a more pessimistic side than you do, John, on that particular one, or at least in terms of what the question proposes. To me, it seems like it's actually more safe if there's actually more division across the
Hmm.
world than less, right? You can't imagine, for example, um, the a state that ultimately ended up comprising, let's say, Saxony, right,
Okay.
in Germany, pulling off the Holocaust. Like Saxony couldn't do that. It could do something maybe on a much smaller scale, but you don't have the ability to mass in that same way as you do once you see the creation of the nation state, right? The
Right.
nation state that can draft its populace, that appeals to patriotism to make these massive armies and be able to do, all these goals that are usually revolve around universalist principles, right? You start to see this around Napoleon. The United States is used as an example of unification after the Civil War too. The idea that, like, hey, it's not better to be confederacies; it's better to be like one large nation state. It's not obvious to me that that development was a good one in terms of human suffering, right? Like most of the large, um, not just in terms of scale, in terms of like, okay, there was more people involved, but the ability to um, conduct events that just resulted in the worst atrocities of the 20th century are almost impossible to envision without these nation states. And in fact, it may be better that they have more smaller units of government across the world that have to act in levels of cooperation with other countries because they don't have it all. So they have to trade, right? And you see a lot of human flourishing result from smaller nation states, right? Like the first, like huge leaps of human flourishing that you see, in Greece, for example, where they had these large confederations of nation states. You can look to even during the Renaissance, right? A lot of creativity and a lot of invention are coming out of these smaller units of government as opposed to larger ones because they have to, by necessity, communicate with each other. They have to trade. They don't have enough political, social, and military mass to be able to just enforce their will upon someone else. So they have to be creative. And so the question remains: if we continue to see these smaller nation states actually become into these larger political entities, what does that do? Does that enable the kind of scenarios that we've seen with the atrocities during the 20th century? Or does it, maybe as we continue to get even bigger than that, if we talk about like one world government, are we going to be able to solve all the problems of the world, right? I'm pessimistic that that's the case. I'm pessimistic that bigger is going to be better. I tend to think that the things that motivate us, as we talked before, in terms of ordered loves, happen to be the people that we can see around us, right? You have a more stronger tie to wanting to protect your family. Beyond that, your group of family. Beyond that, the people that you can see within your radius, and do more good for those people, and also have a better sense of political connection to those things, right? One thing that we've lost in our country has been that, as you've seen the expansion of the federal government, now the senators used to be elected by the states, right? And
Mm-hmm.
now they're just elected in general. You used to be able to get together with a village of your friends and elect, a senator essentially, or a House of Representatives. Now it's like, it's not going to happen, right? Because we have these large political units. And so we're getting more and more um, abstract from the levers of government, right? And so I don't think that's a great trend for a nation. And I think that could possibly be a worse trend for um, humanity as a whole. So I'm actually more hopeful that we see some of these larger states maybe even breaking down in the future, political entities, right? And that doesn't have to be through violence. Sometimes it happens through a civil war, and people split up in this secession. But when we saw the Soviet Union breakdown. I think that was overall like a good thing for humanity. Russia still is a problem, but the smaller states, although they were not without issue, that was not without some serious problems, that had to be dealt with, on the whole, are doing better and have a little bit more ability to steer their own destiny, and arguably have less capacity for atrocities. So that's a very long, convoluted answer to your question, but
no, but a brilliant answer, and I didn't even think about it from your. I had suspected you were going to give me the opposite answer, just from a humanism standpoint, and potentially even a religious standpoint. Right, we're all equal. We're all humans. We're all the same thing, and that we should all be working together. But that was just a brilliant answer and something I just had not considered. But it really does make a lot of sense, right? If you just get too powerful and you have too many, you could really just do a lot of damage. But if there's a bunch of little groups hanging around and they're all nitpicking at each other all the time, then how much damage can they bring upon somebody else? So what a great answer, and really something to give me to think about, which is, by the way, something that Steve Totter does all of the time. By when we're furiously texting during the day, and I ask silly questions, and then Steve reminds me that I'm silly and I need to learn these things and read this book, and gets me straight again. So, but listen, this has been an awesome conversation. It's been so good that we're going to turn it into 2 separate episodes. I'm sure everyone's going to be really interested. They were really, really interested in the first time that you were on, and now we'll give them 2 more episodes, and so now you're ahead of all the other lieutenant colonels with 3, and then some of whom have not even been on yet have 0. Lieutenant Colonel Gray, I'm talking to you, and but nonetheless, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it, and thanks for spending a couple hours with me tonight, Steve.
You got it, John.
Thanks.